Net neutrality can seem confusing, so let's break it down once again. Net neutrality is the basic idea: as an internet user, you can get equal access to all content on the web. Essentially, internet providers shouldn't be allowed to limit what pages you can visit. On May 19th, the FCC began the process of repealing Title II, which gives the FCC legal oversight to enforce net neutrality. If this goes through, it would allow service providers to slow down the bandwidth to websites or even streaming services like Netflix. Providers argue a company like Netflix puts so much strain on their networks it is only fair, or its viewers pay more. There are dozens of internet service providers fighting to end net neutrality. Comcast, as an example, according to the website OpenSecrets.org, in 2014, the company gave nearly $3 million to congressional candidates and provided talking points against net neutrality. The FCC is taking public comment on the matter. So far, nearly 3 million comments have been sent. However, nearly 500,000 of those were found to be posted by a bot or with a false name. Joining us for more on the issue is Reverend Russell Meyer, the Executive Director of the Florida Council of Churches, Rod Thompson, President of the Sarasota Republican Club, and Alyssa Klein, who is a doctoral candidate and teaching associate at the University of South Florida's Department of Sociology. Welcome to you all. And Rod, I want to start with you because you are a big free market guy. Yes, and you heard that web designer express concern in Kate's story that should this happen, it's small businesses that are going to get hurt.
Well, they weren't hurt before the net neutrality rules went into effect. Those are only a few years old. The internet was booming long before that. Small businesses, I work frequently with a guy that's been building websites since the late 90s, and he never noticed any change in anything up till then. I think what we have here is a system where essentially the internet is one of the last things that's not broken. The internet's working fabulously, and to suggest that the government needs to come in and fix something that's not broken is not a good idea.
I don't get it. If we do nothing now, we're not fixing or harming everything. But if we take away net neutrality, isn't that really changing the playing field?
Well, because I was not in favor of net neutrality in the first place. I don't think it was necessary. If you take Netflix, and if you take the idea that I think we'll discuss this evening about access for poor people, my guess is that most really poor people don't have Netflix. We don't have Netflix. So why shouldn't people who can afford Netflix pay a little bit more for the access to it? That only makes sense in a market sense.
Alyssa?
There is an argument there. There's also the argument that for a lot of people, Netflix is a relatively inexpensive luxury compared to cable or something like that. Also, if service providers are able to squeeze content providers like Netflix to have them pay more of the share of internet service, it's not just that there's the potential to bring down the cost of that internet service, but people will pay it in other ways.
Right. You know, there was a description of net neutrality that I read today, and it says something like this. Net neutrality isn't really the internet. Unlike the open internet that has paved the way for so much innovation and given a platform to people who have historically been shut out, would be a closed down network where cable and phone companies call the shots and decide which websites, contents, or applications would succeed. I thought that the conservative point of view is government should not pick winners and losers.
No, absolutely it shouldn't. It shouldn't, which is why you shouldn't have the net neutrality involved, because that is the government trying to affect a private operating system. So you have the ISP providers out there, which are private companies. They should be allowed to offer their product and their service at a price that they deem is right for them. My guess is if you have some operating in this way, that if you allow the free market to operate, you're going to have others that will be able to offer at a whole different pricing schedule and structure in order to maximize their profits.
That's simply not the case. So one of the things that has changed over the last several years is the consolidation of media companies. So there's just a handful of companies now that really run most of the media. And what has happened along the way is telecommunications and information services have been blended. There used to be a firewall between the two of them that made the necessity of net neutrality not needed. But that has been completely blended, and so now content providers are also your telecommunication provider. The firewall no longer works. There needs to be a set of new standards to deal with how the industry has changed, so that if your only access to the internet is through a smartphone, which is the case for most poor people, they can actually get to any site, not be regulated.
All right, we are just getting started with this conversation, and we'll pick it right up after we check the weather. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are discussing net neutrality. The FCC voted to repeal Title II, which allows it to enforce neutrality rules for internet service providers. Our guests tonight are Reverend Russell Meyer of the Florida Council of Churches, Rod Thompson of the Sarasota Republican Club, and Alyssa Klein, a doctoral candidate and teaching associate at USF's Department of Sociology. Rod, I want to get your take on this because right now the current rules say that broadband providers cannot block lawful content, applications, and services or non-harmful devices. You know, we said at the outset that at least some providers give a lot of money to congressional candidates. Could you see a situation where an internet provider may not want to have content on the website from organizations that disagree with their aims in business?
I absolutely could see that. I can see where there could be corruption involved in Congress there. I think we see there's an awful lot of industries where that very problem and dynamic exists. However, you can take a private company like Facebook, which is a massive information provider. A lot of people get a surprising amount of their news through Facebook. And Facebook can choose whatever it wants to block or not block, and it actually does so because it's a private company and the federal government does not have a role or responsibility in ensuring that they allow everything to come out.
In fact, we saw that recently, Alyssa. There was a situation where somebody basically FaceTimed themselves murdering somebody, and Facebook came under a great amount of criticism for allowing that content to be on Facebook. Facebook took it down, but you could see the problem there. Maybe Facebook did the responsible thing, but maybe not all companies would.
There are a few differences there because that's content on their own site. It's a little different than an internet service provider blocking your access to content somewhere else. So because it's within their site, it's a little different in a legal context. But they've had issues before. They were part of an experiment where they put sadder stories on people's news feeds and found out if it actually affected their mood, and they found out it did. And they did that without really informing people. So those manipulations do matter, but I would say there is a difference between Facebook doing it within their own site and a service provider blocking or changing your access to content on other sites.
Now, another big component that people are concerned about is the issue of social justice. And again, you know, part of the information about what's going on here is this. The open internet allows people of color to tell their own stories and organize for racial and social justice. When activists are able to turn out thousands of people in the streets at a moment's notice, it's because ISPs aren't allowed to block their messages or their websites. Reverend Meyer, I mean, a lot of the issues that you're involved with depend on basically people basically learning, crowdsourcing, and getting information. Could you envision a situation where an internet service provider may not, you know, want your organization to be able to organize and get people out on the streets?
Oh, absolutely, and they wouldn't necessarily do it by saying we don't like that political activity. They do it based, if we're using a market analysis tool, what generates revenue. And so if there's activity that doesn't generate revenue for their business model, then they're going to block that, and they're going to favor activity that does do that. We see that already happening in the media industry in all kinds of ways. That's what part of the fear of the consolidation of journalism media has been all about. And so when we say free market, we have to understand that that comes with a pinch on other forms of speech and activity. There's a preference being made to economic gain over other kinds of social value and social relationships. And we need to have a larger conversation in this country about what we consider really the more bedrock kinds of values in our society. One of the difficulties with always referring back to the free market is it's preferencing economic relationships, saying over your love for your family or your love for the well-being in your community in other kinds of ways. And so when you have a methodology that says we're going to allow an economic metric to be the determinant for how and what content is delivered, all kinds of non-economic content going to be cut out.
Rod, I saw you shaking your head.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I agree totally with the Reverend that that is an excellent conversation to have. We have a lot of companies that have a lot of social justice content, and they take their good corporate citizenship, seriously. What I don't think, though, is we have a place for the government to come in and mandate what is good corporate citizenship, what is social justice and what isn't, and force companies to operate. So I would totally agree about having that conversation. I would choose to support, not support. So for instance, I don't shop at Target because I don't like a lot of what they do and they support. That's one way the free market can actually operate there. You see consistently, you see protests against companies and retail stores and others because of what they do and don't do that people consider right and wrong. I think that is the way to go about it as opposed to the government mandating laws.
Listen, let me ask you this because you study these things. What impact do you think this would have long term? I'm thinking about over the last couple of months after the election when you had the Women's March. A lot of that was organized both locally and in Washington by people reading about it on the internet. Are you concerned that the way these kinds of protests or organized may change if internet providers may limit organizations from, basically putting out the invitation?
Absolutely, that is one of the fears. You mentioned media consolidation, and that is definitely part of the problem. But even further than media consolidation is how much media companies are increasingly part of larger conglomerates that have complicated economic interests, and they could. I mean, there remains the possibility with the loss of net neutrality that they could block information about protests or other political activities, or even potentially that if there's a news outlet that gives them or one of their subsidiaries unfavorable coverage, they could make it harder to access content from that news source. We already have people complaining about niche news. This would drive us further in that direction.
Rod, you are also a former journalist.
Right. So if you take Sarasota here, this has been a one newspaper town for something like 40 years now. And you can see in the coverage, say, of when you have pro-life protests where they had the hands chained, they had thousands of people, that got a photo often on page 3B, whereas a protest that's on a different issue that has 10 people might get a page 1. That's totally the Sarasota Herald Tribune's prerogative to do that. I think that's unfair. I think that they were blocking coverage. I think they were doing, in principle, exactly what Elisa is talking about here through their newspaper, but they should be free to do that from government interference.
Well, I disagree.
I'll give you the last word.
Because, when the Green Revolution was ongoing in Iran, it was driven by Twitter, and then the government shut down Twitter to stop the Green Revolution. We all howled about that. But the argument that's being made right now is if Comcast wanted to do the same thing that the Iranian government should do, we should allow that to happen because that's free market. I'm going to argue, no, that's just wrong behavior. Anything that would cut down democratic participation, we should block that.
All right, we have to take a quick break, and when we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests, plus what some of our viewers are saying about last night's topic, the decline in black voter turnout. Stay with us. The chairman of the FCC says net neutrality's days are numbered. If the agency repeals Title II, there will be no regulations in place to enforce equal access to the internet. It is less regulation a good thing? And if you support net neutrality, what can you do to protect it? Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. And Alyssa, I'm interested in your take because you study these things. What do you want our viewers to walk away with tonight?
There are a lot of different possibilities depending on what internet service providers decide to do with these new freedoms that they have. But the old adage that you have to have money to make money really does hold true. We see this in all kinds of research for individuals as well as for businesses. The fewer resources you have, the fewer opportunities you have for upward mobility. The internet historically has been, as long as we've had it, has been a force that has leveled the playing field a little at least. So as the net becomes even less neutral, that is just going to reinforce inequalities we already have.
Does Alyssa have a point?
Potentially. What I think, but I mean, I think
that's a victory.
I think, my takeaway, though, is that if you look at this, and I don't think the Reverend's going to like this formulation, but if you look at this as a risk-reward situation, the risk, or the reward, is that you have more equal access for everybody to the internet. The risk, however, is that you have an increasingly encroaching government on the internet. My great fear is that that camel's nose under the tent flap not only brings in the rest of the camel, but a whole army of camels called regulators, in which the government ultimately ends up regulating content, what we fear Comcast would do, the government would.
Reverend, you get the last word.
Well, the government's not the boogie person here, and it's time we stop thinking about that way. What we need is smart government, not no government. I can take you to Somalia. I'll show you what no government looks like. And so what made this nation great was FDR and the TVA and rural electrification and making certain the telephone went to every farmhouse. We have not done that with broadband. We made it almost impossible for people in rural areas and in urban depressed areas to get access to the internet. I had to drive to Groveland yesterday. My phone didn't leave once I left once I left Tampa Bay. Only when it came back, then it started like dancing all over the place. We've really failed most of America in making certain that we deliver the internet everywhere. Now what we're saying is we're going to let the few content providers determine what content people get. This is a recipe for disaster.
We have to leave it there. Thank you very much. But before we go, we want to share with you what some of our viewers are saying about last night's topic, the lower turnout of black voters in the 2016 election. According to a report from Pew Research, the percentage of African Americans who voted in the presidential election was less than 60%, down nearly 7% from 2012, while the number of American voters in every other demographic increased, while some attribute it to the Democratic Party assuming black voters would support it, to Barack Obama not being on the ballot. We wanted you to know what you thought about this. And Billy Brooks Jr. writes, you had two of the worst candidates ever to win the two-party system, both corrupt, driven by ego and amassing wealth. Two candidates who said anything and everything to win votes. The black community just wasn't falling for the pandering and the promises. Yvette Marie writes, voter suppression. And Kenneth Lamars writes, my guess is because Hillary was projected to win by the polls, plain and simple. Well, what do you think about net neutrality? Should it come to an end, or should access to the internet remain unimpeded? Join the conversation by visiting our Facebook page at facebook.com/news@7. And FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. Thanks to our guests for being here. Reverend Russell Meyer is the Executive Director of the Florida Council of Churches. Rod Thompson is the President of the Sarasota Republican Club. And Alyssa Klein is a doctoral candidate and teaching associate at the University of South Florida's Department of Sociology.